Okay, so, welcome back. I don't know when I'm going to end up releasing this one relative to the last episode, but for me, I'm actually recording this the day after the last one, so I really don't have that much in the way of a preface other than to thank, once again, all of the patrons, and then pick back up right where we left off. So first of all, since yesterday, I've realized that this form here, which I was debating about how exactly the liquid dissimilation rule would manifest, I realized that I forgot yet again about the epenthesis rule, which happens before the roticization of S and would split up the R and the S at the end of the word, so we in fact would not get a geminate there, it would be nimirillos. So that completely sidesteps that whole issue. Although I do still need to decide exactly how the liquid dissimilation thing is going to manifest. Need to do some more reading on that. Also, on the topic of sound changes, I did decide to formalize that rule. Originally we had something like this earlier on in history, but I moved it down to this part after word final vowels have already been lost, so that all word final H's go to the velar fricative. I just think that's a nice alternative to just getting rid of them entirely. Anyway, back to these evidentials. So what I'm trying to decide is whether or not the two different evidentials should come from different person markers to make them noticeably phonologically distinct from each other, or if they should both come from khatta. And the reason why I say they should both come from khatta instead of both coming from nida is because if the evidential begins with an N and it attaches to any of these forms that end in a K, that sequence is not allowed in this language's phonotactics, unless we say that it is and it gets reintroduced. Because earlier in history, anytime you had a cluster of a stop immediately followed by a nasal, the stop disappeared and the nasal geminated. So the question is, does that happen here too? So I guess I can think of three different possibilities. Let's just say, for example, that we've got this nidak form, and for the sake of simplicity, let's say that the evidential suffix is na. So option one is that we say in this particular environment, because it's a clitic, and because this comes well after previous stop nasal clusters were destroyed, then it is permissible to just have nidakna or nidakna as a form, which, by the way, I'll talk about stress in a second. But that's option one, nidakna. Option two is to say that that cluster stays illegal, and so maybe that K disappears, and you just get nidana. That feels a little bit less likely to me and a touch contrived, but I don't think it's impossible. There are certainly cases in languages where when you apply a clitic to a word, it changes the stem in some way. Like in my dialect of English, when you use the modal verb can, and you negate it, it becomes can't. The vowel quality changes. I don't actually know why that's the case, but that's what it does. And then option three would be to say that there's some sort of epenthesis, or some other little similar repair strategy that comes along, to space out the K and the N. So maybe you get nidakana. I don't think any of those are ideal, which is why I think it might be easier if they just both come from khatta. Because this velar fricative will weaken into an H, and then I imagine it will be fairly easy to justify that it will then get lost completely. And the other thing that we have to consider is vowel harmony. Does the vowel harmony of the auxiliary extend into the evidentials? We could justify it either way because they're clitics. Very often things like clitics or compounds or things like that are immune to harmony. However, in Turkish, the interrogative auxiliary, which I think is technically classed as a clitic even though it's written as a separate word, that takes its harmony from the lexical verb that precedes it. Or I think whichever word happens to come before it, because it does have some ability to move around the sentence as well. I will have to see what the forms look like before I can decide that. And as I alluded to earlier, the other consideration is stress. Since they're clitics, they may or may not drag the stress back. And it kind of depends when they happen as well, because we do have this stress shift that happens fairly late in history. So as long as they came along before this point, which I think they probably would, then I think it would be justifiable to say that they shift the stress if they create a long or closed syllable. Okay, so thinking about what sort of phonological forms we want to give these things. Like I mentioned last time, I think this is a good excuse to come up with a word final sound that is not very well represented elsewhere in the language, just because of how common these case endings are in everything else. We've got lots of word final N's, lots of word final R's, more than a few word final S's, a fair few word final K's, so this is our opportunity to use a different sound for that. We've got a pretty small and manageable inventory to work with. I feel like I am underrepresenting the voiced stops so far, so I might go with one of those. Let's try using a D. If we say the original verb was just da, or something similar, and if we just say, for example, that this is the reportative, then the conjugated form would be khatada, and that would mean one says. And then through sound changes, the velar fricative would weaken into an H, and that final vowel would get lost. However, with additional phonological reduction, I'm thinking one of two things could happen. One is that T and that D would blend together into a geminate, so we'd end up with something like hatta. Or we could say the D dominates and we end up with hadda. Or the other option is to say that that T gets skipped over because it's essentially just part of the person marker, and we just get hard. I think because there are a fair few of these forms that do have geminates, especially these form 4 in the negative, to have the evidential also have a geminate, to get something like nakkada, not really feeling that, whereas something like hard, nakkahad. And then I think it's feasible to say that the H is lost as well, so that could just become nakkad. That's not bad. That's really not bad. And then for words that end in consonants, we could say that the H sticks around, so we get nirhad and nanhad. But then again, what happens when there's a K? Does that geminate the K like it did historically? Or does the H still just disappear? Does the H only stick around when there's a resonant coda? And then there's forms like this that already have an H in them, so that would be like vahanhad, which is less good. In that case, the H may drop out there as well, so we get vahanad. It might be easier to just say that the H gets lost everywhere, so we get nanad and nirad. It's still pretty good, but I do like the resonant plus H clusters. I don't know, either way I think we can make that work. Oh, and of course, if the H did stick around there, then that would create a closed syllable, so it would shift the stress, so it would be vahanhad, which is still pretty bad. I think one way or another we can make it work. If all else fails, we can just cut the H entirely. So then, if we run with that, and say that the proto-verb for to say is da, it doesn't have to be da, that final vowel isn't really important because it just gets cut anyway. Unless it was an I, because then it would cause umlaut. Okay, trying them both out, I'm pretty sure I'm going to go with da, because that one gives us slightly more diverse forms, and it gives us an O, by virtue of our new diphthong simplification rules. I still feel like this language is lacking an O. We could always use some more O. But I almost forgot that the dubitative is the reportative reduplicated. If we do say that the reportative is hard, then the dubitative would be a hadad? I think it would be hadad. Or actually, the D going to the intervocalically happened very recently. So I can imagine that that would happen here too. So hadad. That's actually not bad either. But then of course we still have to think about what the vowel harmony is doing. So the front vowel harmony happened a while ago. Definitely not ancient history, but there have been a fair few changes since then. So it just kind of depends on whether these clitics came before or after this point. Oh, that's a good point. Word final vowel loss happens here. So if the clitics were already firmly attached to the end of these things and were considered sort of part of the auxiliary, then that would protect the word final vowels in these forms from being lost. And I don't think we want that, because then that means that an extra syllable, essentially, would appear for all of these. Although that does give us a potential option for the issue of what if this had or need ending gets attached to a word that ends in a K. Actually, wait, no it doesn't, because that word didn't have a vowel after the K. The only reason it ends in a K is because of the metathesis stuff, which is a whole other issue, because if we say that, then that R, which was originally an S, and that K would stay together. So the normal affirmative form would be tarak, but then when you add the evidential, it would be taskahad. No, we're not doing that. Again, under the majority of circumstances, I would be okay with an alternation like that, but specifically in this case, I am envisioning these evidentials as being more of just a thing that you can just tack on to the end of any of these, and there you go. Nothing more complex involved than that. I definitely don't want to have to go through all of these and figure out what all the changes would be with this extra syllable at the end. So that being the case, the clitics would still be independent, or at least still seen as separable and distinct from the auxiliary, until after this point. And funnily enough, that is almost exactly when the stress shift happens. So for this hadad form, with those two long vowels in there, if we attach it to this form tarak, if we say that the evidentials only attached after the stress shift happened, and therefore applying the evidential would not alter stress, then tarak would keep its stress on the ta, and for the dubitative you'd get tarakadad, whereas if it did shift the stress you'd get tarakadad. I guess both of those are potentially fine. Okay, I think for the sake of simplicity and ease, we'll say that the evidentials only happened after word final vowel loss, after the stress shift. For all intents and purposes, they remain distinct and detachable. They might even have some freedom to attach to other verbal elements as well. So we're going to say for the time being that they are immune to vowel harmony and they do not shift the stress. Okay, assuming we are sticking with that one for the reportative, which I think I will because I do like that reduplication. I can't really think of many of these other sounds that would sound as nice with a reduplicated form. Then the inferential could either begin with an N or another H. Well, if we do say that the evidentials attached so relatively recently in history, then that means there's going to be very few actual sound changes occurring between the evidential and the auxiliary at the interface between them. So that initial N there, before a consonant like a K, I'm thinking that might just come out as a normal KN cluster. But at the same time, that kind of feels like a violation of the language's phonotactics. I don't know, we'll think about that in a second. First of all, let's choose another ending consonant. If any, I mean it could end in a vowel too, that's a valid possibility. But the original protoform probably had at least one consonant. Though that consonant could have been a protoconsonant and been lost or reduced to nothingness, leaving us just with a vowel. The point I'm trying to make is we need to decide what this thing looks like. So I don't want to do an N, because we've used that too much. Don't want to do a B or a D, because we've already used one voiced stop. I don't want to use another one. Already have lots of these ending in K. This might just be my personal bias, but every time I hear word final Q, that to me is very strongly reminiscent of the Inuit languages. I mean, I like the sound of word final Q, I think it's good. I'm just not 100% sure I'm feeling it here. We'll leave that one in for now. We already have plenty of word final S and R and the semivowels. You know, I'm thinking that maybe, in honor of our new change, where we now do have word final H's, or at least word final velar fricatives, maybe we should do that here. But if we go with this chata form, then that's already going to give us an initial H for this syllable anyway. So we're going to get something like chach. Does that sound okay? Naihach, uhach, tirihach. Yeah, that's doable, I think. Whereas if we went with the N form, we would get like önach, irnach, tirinach. I do like that one better. Okay, first of all, to get that word final H, we would need some protoform that was something like acha. Again, the vowels don't particularly matter, or at least the final vowel doesn't, because that's just going to be dropped anyway. Unless it's an I, in which case it would cause umlaut. Oh, but that means that for this one, if we went with chata, the T in the velar fricative would merge into a geminate, so it would come out as hatta in the final form. And again, I'm not too keen on that. So in order to say that's not the case, it would have to be a long vowel. You know, I probably don't want the vowel in this one to be an A, just to distinguish it from this had some more, if we use a different vowel. If we say the protoform was like iha, then that would inevitably result in them becoming nicht and hich, respectively. And just to make sure, if we reduplicate them, we get nicht, or maybe ninich if the first H drops away, or hichich. And I do not like those very much. Especially the first one, because if we have something like nan up here, then the dubitative, if we use this one, would be naninich, which is not good. So yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm going to stick with had as the one that gets reduplicated to become the dubitative. So we don't have to worry about that. I am actually leaning towards the N initial one. Still don't know what to do with these final Ks, but overall I like that one better. Oh, actually, something that's just occurred to me. All of these forms with the final K are negative. And that begs the question, can you even combine an evidential with a negative in this language? Because there are some languages where that's just straight up not allowed. Because depending on how the language evolved, there may be some ambiguity there as to whether or not the negative negates the evidential meaning or the actual verb meaning. But I think that seeing as these evidentials are understood to be clitics and separate from the rest of the auxiliary complex, I don't see a reason why they wouldn't be allowed to mix with the negatives. I think it's perfectly clear and understood that the negative refers to the meaning of the auxiliary. Okay, so that doesn't help very much. I don't think I've ever had a situation in any of my conlangs where compounding or affixing two words together would result in an illegal word medial cluster. Like, I'm just thinking of Nakashti here, where words can only end in a very limited set of sounds. So anytime you compound words together, it's automatically going to be fine, because every single possible combination of the allowable word final consonants in a word medial cluster is acceptable. Although there are sometimes some additional phonological rules that have to take place as well. But here, I just don't know how the language would handle that final K now forming the coda of a cluster. The only example that I can immediately think of something like this happening is in English the apostrophe S genitive clitic, where if you attach it to a word that already ends in an S, you have to insert an epenthetic vowel. So like box becomes boxes. So maybe it's reasonable to say that the same thing happens here. So either we go with hich, and just say that that initial H drops away whenever it's convenient, or we go with nicht, which sounds nicer, but presents an additional phonological difficulty. And depending on which we go for, the protoverb would either mean to sense or to seem. It's a tough call, but I'm going to rough in for now that we're going to go with the nicht form. And I will just hope that I find a suitable solution for that later. And with the icha verb, we get out these principal parts, which look pretty nice. Okay, I've got those verbs inputted into the modern lang and the proto-lang. Leave that hich form there just in case we do have to go with it. And with that, our evidentials are looking pretty solid. Cool, so while we're here, I think it's time we tackle another piece of auxiliary morphology, the interrogative. It's time to talk about yes or no questions. So, kind of like the evidentials, I am envisioning this interrogative as being a clitic that you stick at the end of the auxiliary verb to turn the verb meaning into a yes or no question. Kind of like the ne question ending in Latin. You just stick ne at the end of a verb and it turns it into a question. Now, I've only roughed in one interrogative here, but there are multiple different types of questions. So more than likely there will be one sort of standard interrogative ending that will be the default way of forming yes or no questions. But there are also conjectural questions, which are questions where you expect the answer to be yes. So it's the difference between, did Bob eat the sandwich? Versus, Bob ate the sandwich, didn't he? So there may be some way of marking those that's different from a normal question. And then there might be a separate way of forming rhetorical questions where you don't actually expect an answer. Or I've also heard reference to statements of wonder, as in like, I wonder if Bob ate the sandwich, which is kind of a question, but also kind of not. And I'm not going to include it here because I don't think I'm going to do anything special for this. But there's also incredulatives, where it's like, Bob ate the sandwich? ? Exclamation point. Where you're not really inquiring about any information specifically, or more just expressing surprise. Now that's sort of dipping into discourse stuff that we're probably going to discuss later. For right now, let's just focus on basic interrogatives. So for a standard yes-no question. So question particles and question affixes are very, very common cross-linguistically, and they can come from a bunch of different places. One word that, as I understand, quite commonly gives rise to an interrogative particle is or not as well. That's pretty common. The negative in general often gets mixed up with question particles. And apparently and can sometimes give rise to question particles too, which I can kind of see that. You can sort of do that in English if you say something like, and Bob ate the sandwich. It's sort of putting forward the statement as being sort of presumptive and inquiring as to whether or not it's correct. So yeah, you could see that. They can also very commonly come from longer phrases that get reduced down. I'm thinking of French where est-ce que is literally, is it that? It's essentially just become a single question word. And also if the negative gets involved, it could be, is it not? Like, I have a friend who's from Shanghai, and sometimes when she's speaking English, she'll just use isn't it as a sort of general question word. So she'll say something like, you have work tomorrow, isn't it? So that seems pretty intuitive. Also a word like so or thus, which again, we can kind of do that in English if we say something like, so Bob ate the sandwich. I've also seen if become a question particle as well. Also maybe. Any kind of verb morphology that has some sort of encoding of possibility or some other kind of modality like that could also turn into interrogative morphology. And I'm pretty sure I've seen interrogative pronouns or something like what also turning into a question word. So yeah, there's quite a few options available to us. Now for many of these, the lexical source wouldn't need to be derived from anything else. We could just come up with a phonological form and just declare it as a root. Like or, for example. We could just come up with a form for that, and there we go. But with is it that, or is it not, we already have words for it is and it is not, which are actually up here in the auxiliary chart because the copula is giving rise to the auxiliaries. So it is would be the inanimate forms, in forms 1 and 2, or the impersonal, potentially, whereas it is not would be these negative equivalents. Now, the big problem I can immediately see with that is if you wanted to say a sentence like, is the rock big? Then the auxiliary for that would be e, but then to turn it into a question, you would also put e afterwards, so you would get e. Or same thing with the negative, it would be e. Or if you were asking a negative question, it would be e. So those kind of suck. Let's not do that. So if we are going to involve not, we already have this e form for the negative in the protolang. So again, that's already half of the phonological form done. So if we were going to go with or not, then the protoform would be u with some sort of prefix. Now, one concern I have is that many of these forms already have a y in them. That's not a huge problem though, because most of the time that y will just get lost anyway as it assimilates into the u. So after word final vowel loss happens, that should essentially just end up as a short e. And then, depending on whether or not the interrogative changes in accordance with vowel harmony, that would either be e or e. I'm tempted to say, just for the sake of simplicity, that these interrogatives follow the same rules as the evidentials, and that they're immune to vowel harmony and they don't shift stress. But I'm going to keep playing around with the forms until I decide that for sure. So some of the sounds I think I should be using more of are L and Q. Now with Q, that is not allowed to come in coda position in the protolang. So it would be something like ka, which combining with U would give us kai, which I think with additional reduction and once vowel harmony kicks in, I think it would just end up as k. Even if there was a vowel there, that wouldn't affect how that was reduced, it would still be akla. And with the L, if that L were in coda position immediately before that Y, then it would become palatalized, and then later it would just turn into a Y anyway, so we just get the same E ending. I'm thinking I might not actually include the negative. It's very common for the negative to get involved, but it's definitely not mandatory. Actually, thinking about it now, I'd never put this together before, but someone who knows more about Latin than me, is the ne question marker cognate with the ne negative? That had never even occurred to me before, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if that was the case. That's interesting. Anyway, if we're not going with the yi, then that gives us a lot more freedom to just come up with whatever phonological form we like and just say it means one of these things. So what form would I like for this? I am strongly tempted to just say that it's vowel initial, just to sidestep all of those issues we were having with the word final consonant of the auxiliary and how that affects things. So if we just said it was al, for example, we would get like nayal, niral, nanal, nidanal. It's okay. I'm actually not sure if I like the L there, though. And I think I'd prefer to keep it as one syllable, too. If we went with a Q then, nayak, nirak, sirak, karakak. That's actually kind of hard to say. Karakak. From uvula to velar geminate, then back to uvula again. It's a little bit unwieldy. Arkakak. Not great. I don't think the final uvula goes well with the final K is the thing. Okay, what if we just made it then a final T, for example? Nayat, nirat, takayat, karakat. Yeah, that's not too bad. And we haven't actually used very many final T's yet at all. We've got a handful of them just as a result of the metathesis. But yeah, that's not too bad. And then do I want to keep that A vowel? Or I guess the bigger question is, how does vowel harmony affect it, if at all? With no vowel harmony, this one would be urat, but with vowel harmony it would be urat. Oh, and by the way, I'm sure with this one, or this one, e, whatever the vowel is would just give way, and you just get a T at the end of that. It and eat. Once again, I think if we say that this interrogative thing attaches too early, then that's going to have lots of phonological side effects that'll force me to redo a lot of these, and I don't want that. Yeah, I think it's, again, just going to have to come after the word final vowel loss stage. That's the only way to stop it from having phonological knock-on effects. And if that's the case, then vowel harmony is already very well established. So unless we pull a Turkish and say that vowel harmony spreads into the interrogative auxiliary as well, it's probably going to be immune to vowel harmony. So then whichever vowel we want in that position, we should be able to justify. Honestly, I think I am feeling just a normal A. Yeah, I think honestly I'm just good with at. Seems deceptively simple, but for now I think I'm just going to go with that. So in the Proto-Lang, it might have had an initial consonant that disappeared later down the line. It had to have ended in a vowel, because words in the Proto-Lang weren't allowed to end in stops. It can't be an I, because that would cause umlaut. Let's just make it a U, because why not? And then it's just a matter of choosing the lexical source. Which one makes the most sense to me? So keeping in mind the auxiliary verb construction system thing, so to say, I saw the dog, you'd have I am wrapped up in the auxiliary, then the converb while seeing with the dog as its object. So to turn that into a question, what I want is for it to attach to the I am part. Now, if we go with or is usually I think there's a special word for it, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but like a medial or like interconnecting conjunction. Like it needs to specifically come between two elements. Whereas here it would be like, I am or while seeing the dog, which seems incomplete to me, so I don't think we're going to go with that one. Same with and, I think it would just need to have some sort of connecting element to it. We've already dismissed these possibilities. Thus, actually, I think that makes sense. I am thus while seeing the dog. I mean, adverbs tend to be able to jump around a lot anyway, so something like thus or therefore. I am therefore seeing a dog would be like, am I seeing a dog? I think that one makes sense to me, so Yeah, that's pretty cool. And I can imagine this little art element will surface at various other times in other discourse markers, or it might even survive as an independent word, who knows. Okay, that is pretty cool. I feel like last episode I was kind of all over the place, but I'm feeling good about this one. I am now running out of time. However, as per tradition, I think we'll end with a new noun, and not just any new noun, but I think I'm going to do something that's going to be a little bit of a preview of something I want to bring up next time, and that is verb nominalization. How do you turn a verb into a noun in this language? So what immediately comes to mind, what I usually do with class languages, is to say you are allowed to take a verb root and just apply the different class markers and derive nouns that way. So if you take a verb and stick it in the human class, you get an agent noun. If you stick it in the animate class, I guess you would get an animal that does that, or maybe a tool or something, like an instrument. I don't know, probably some variation there. And in the inanimate, that would just be a general, like an abstract noun. So I basically just want to see if that will work. So if we take a verb, let's just grab the first one that we have, which is alhi, to sleep. We're going to have to move this over to make room. So let's take alhi, to sleep, and let's stick it in the human singular class to turn it into a word that means sleeper. So this one does end in a vowel, but I've made a separate row for it to signify that there's a consonant cluster preceding the final vowel. Okay, let's blaze through these forms. The singulars are looking pretty good. There's some vowel alternation in the initial syllable in the dative. Duals are following the typical pattern of other human nouns, except there's no difference between the singular and the dual, which is interesting. Okay, so it looks like it is pretty much following the same pattern as Souther here, with the exception of the locative plural, which has a long stressed E, whereas here it's an R. And honestly, I don't know why I had it as a stressed E, because it would be Sjadiagarhin in the proto-lang. So yeah, it should be a long A. Okay, well, so the main thing I wanted to see is how much overlap there was between the nominalized forms and the verbal forms. And the answer is basically none. So you can always tell when it's being used as a noun and when it's being used as a verb. Okay, cool, that is a good sign. And I'm going to do some more tests with that next time. So let's just finish off quickly with another example sentence. Looking at some of the other nouns we have. How about, the sleeper loves the child? We still don't have too many nouns yet, so we've got to work with what we got. And sure, we'll make this one habitual, why not? In which case, habitual is form 1 combined with the second principal part. So form 1 for a human singular noun is vai. Then the second principal part of to love is mur. But between them comes first the subject, which is ilhu, sleeper, or one who sleeps, and then comes child in the accusative, which is nilwas. So vai ilhu nilwas mur. And then, just to test out our evidentials, the sleeper loves the child, so I've been told. So we stick on the reportative, vaiad ilhu nilwas mur. And then for an inferential, we just swap out the evidential, vainich ilhu nilwas mur. And then finally, to turn that into a question, does the sleeper love the child? And that would be vaiat ilhu nilwas mur. It does occur to me that vaiad and vaiat sound kinda similar, but I'm not too bothered by that. I am consistently surprised by how often languages distinguish what I would think to be very crucial pieces of information just by making very, very small little tweaks, like a change from an E vowel to an E vowel or something. Or like the one that stands out to me is, actually, sort of referencing what we were talking about earlier, with the modal verb can. The can't shift in vowel quality doesn't happen in American English. They just keep the vowel as a, and the final T in the negative is just a glottal stop. So you have can and can't, and that's the only difference between the affirmative and negative. It's astonishing to me that that can remain stable. I mean, admittedly, most of the time in the affirmative, can is going to reduce to kun anyway, but still, if you're stressing it, it's amazing to me that that can be consistently understood. Anyway, I'm pretty pleased with all of that, and I am now officially over time. So that'll be it for today. Join me next time where we're probably going to continue this discussion about verb nominalization and see where that takes us. So thank you very much for watching once again, and I will see you next time.